Good evening, colleagues. Seemingly, it looks like we all had visuals on our screen without audio. We apologize profusely for such and will not further delay the program. We've invited Mr. Zwane for tonight's conversation, a former member of the Black Management Forum, Johannesburg branch, of course, and a senior executive in the financial sector, whose introduction will be given in brief detail by our host for tonight, Nolwazi Mthi, a member of Johannesburg branch. The sessions for tonight is wholly inspired by the article written by Mr. Zwane titled Awkward Transitions. Mr. Zwane himself worked in the financial sector before transiting to public sector and returning to financial sector. Throughout, he speaks largely about the awkward transition and the difficulty in transiting across sectors and across sectors as in public and private, and again across various sectors as in from the financial sector to go and deal with government, specifically in the area of funding the students, which the business are quite different from one another, or the operating standards and processes are quite different. So we've invited him because at large, in the article he have written, Awkward Transition, he also talked at large about the impact of this on transformation, on BBEE. And again, he also talked about the lack of support the executives found themselves not receiving at C-suite level. He cited an example of the departure of Mr. Minele, amongst others, and again, the slow pace of transformation in the financial sector as noted by Banking Association of South Africa in 2020. And we believe that tonight, from his bowel of wisdom of having been in awkward situations, he will share his wisdom with us. He will too give us wise counsel on how to navigate across sectors and across awkward positions. Without much ado, as Johannesburg, it is always a delight and a pleasure to host you all. Over to you, Ms. Mthi, to introduce our speaker and invite our speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chair. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. As our chair has already mentioned, I am Nolwazi Mthi. I am part of the BMF Johannesburg Manco, and I will be introducing our esteemed guest, Mr. Stephen Zwane. I have a full profile here that I am going to read for Mr. Zwane, but I don't think we could really compact everything that he's done and the wealth of knowledge and wisdom that he'll be sharing with us today. Amongst his many decorations, if I could use that word, he's a business leader and a social entrepreneur, currently a chief operating officer at ABSA, a former CEO at the National Student Financial Aid Scheme, mostly known as NSFAS. He is the founder and chairman of the award-winning Youth Leadership and Entrepreneurship Development nonprofit organization. He's also a seasoned executive with over 18 years of business leadership experience, having served as a director at ABSA, managing director that I've mentioned at NSFAS, director at Barclays, a senior manager at FNB, and a junior management consultant. He has a few international qualifications, such as a master's degree in business administration from Durham University in the UK, and a certificate in global executive management in SA, Netherlands, Russia, and a certificate in the International Executive Development Program, US, Uganda, and England. He is an award-winning lecturer and facilitator at GIPS. And I think this is very key for me to share as we enter this. His life mission is helping others reach their full potential. And I truly hope that by sharing his wisdom today, he'll at least unlock something in each of us that helps us to transition better. And yes, to just draw from his experience. So Mr. Stephen Zwane, I'd like to welcome you to the floor.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's always very awkward when you hear people read out your profile, and you know that sometimes you're speaking to people who are much more accomplished than you are. But thank you, Nolwazi. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Mr. Zwane. As our chair has mentioned, that the biggest inspiration for us with this session was the article that you wrote about awkward transitions, in which you really highlight transitioning from the private sector, where you have a few structures and governance and a clear mandate, into the public sector, where your biggest net worth is your political affiliation and how liked you really are by the ministers, and how that influences the buy-in that you get, and furthermore, your success within the private sector. I noted a few key things that you mentioned about the transition, which is, stakeholder buy-in and support is very important. You need to have a clear mandate as you're stepping into your role, and the importance of having political readiness. Can you please maybe speak to us a little bit further about your article and your overall journey?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure. I wrote the stuff from personal experience. And in 2007, I think it must have been May the 31st, I got an exciting call from the chairman of NSFAS to say I was successful as a candidate to go and work at NSFAS as the chief executive officer there. I think I was just too excited on two grounds. Firstly, I was a beneficiary of NSFAS. Secondly, I felt I'd earned enough skills and competences to be able to make a success of NSFAS. I think I went a lot with the heart and trusting that all intentions of what was supposed to be done there, they were all very good. So I think that's really how I went about. And I must tell you that I did not do enough of the homework, except knowing who the DG was and knowing who the minister was. And also it was at a time when there was a lot of changing landscape politically in South Africa. So I went in, and all I wanted to do was to put my head down, try and transform the institution as best as I could. I was not prepared for a divided board that was half more public sector and half private sector. And there was already some level of angst against people coming from the private sector into the public sector. So I already was on the back foot from decisions that I put to the board that were always turned down. And when I got back into the office, everybody knew that Stephen did not get his way with the board. And I think for me, that was a really rude awakening. I trusted that everything political will be dealt with by the chair, and that my responsibility was to make sure that we transform the organization. I think the biggest rude awakening for me was when it became quite clear that political lineage was one of the key success factors in the role. That number two, there were particular alliances that would have needed to form to be successful in the role. And I can tell you that when there was a change in leadership, when Dr. Nzimande was replaced by Professor Hlengiwe Mkhize into the role, I found ourselves really feeling confident that we could execute our role with a great deal of excitement. There was a good working relationship at the time, except for the announcement of the FIFRI at the end of the conference in 2017-16 December. I think maybe I don't know if it was the amount of money announced of 56 billion over 5 years that created a very different fertile ground for engagements, for hostility, for casting doubt in the leadership, for being blamed for things that were systemic for many years. But I think for me that was really quite a difficult one. Not only was it difficult sitting in a board that was divided, it was also difficult working with employees who boasted about their political affiliation, their network, and their ability to take you down at will, and they exposing the fact that you have no one protecting you, you're all by yourself. And I thought I was an administrator in the work. So I think how that ended was a huge lesson for me. There are two main lessons that came out of that. That firstly, if I knew that the ticket to operate was a political ticket, I would not have taken that opportunity. I wanted to go there and make a difference. I wanted there to get things done. I wanted to meet the mandate of the financial aid scheme. I wanted to meet the expectations of South Africa and the expectations of the board. Number two, if I knew that the political ticket was critical, I would have taken a little bit more time before I make any form of thinking about transitioning into the public sector. I think number three was realizing that it was almost a career suicide to have taken up the opportunity. Because at the way that ended when the minister dissolved the board and NSFAS tried to ping everything wrong with the institution in my name after having the 11 months, that made it very difficult for me to be attractive back to the market as an administrator. You can imagine the sense of depression you've got. Your own self-worth is questioned. You're always an achiever. You always wanted to get things right, always wanted to win. And the outcome of that was actually, when you self-reflect, even the people that believed in you before were looking at you through the lenses of how NSFAS ended, and now you are tainted with a bribe that says you are an ineffective administrator, ineffective leader, you couldn't turn things around, you failed in your leadership duties. So I think for me, it was those dark moments that made me realize that actually taking up this job was more a curse than it was a blessing during that particular moment. Even when I went in for interviews, I think when people realized or did a Google search and found my name, they put the CV on file 13. So I think for me, that's when I thought, okay, so if something like this, trying to do country duty, and this is what happens, I then started looking at this from an empirical evidence point of view. I said, is it me alone, or it has happened over time? And I started making an assessment and looking at leaders who gone into these roles from public sector from the private sector into public sector. I found that there was a minimum to little success. Most of the time, if you transitioned, there must have been an explicit support from the higher echelons of politics for you to be quite successful. I also found the environment to be very hostile towards Black executives, as it was for white and sort of Indian or even colored executives that transitioned. I found that the environment itself became very hostile. It was a zero-sum game. And you as a professional, a member of BMF who is upwardly mobile, want to get the best out of your work, want to go out there and make a difference, and live by the badge of BMF for being that astute manager that will be able to transform. And that for me was a very sad situation, that we turn on each other when we get into this particular environment. And I think the worst part was organizations that are supposed to be advocating for Black excellence, for success of such transitions like the BMF, they seem to be more than happy to make an announcement who's moved into a big role, but not really play a part into what happened there. How come one of our own comes out scarred the way they were scarred, and what can be done differently? I think for me, those are some of the key disappointments. So I really felt like I was out in the cold and nothing I could do. So what did I then learn when I wrote this article? I then realized that I can share some particular key takeouts. I found a model that was out there that was adequately defined around leadership transition. And this model was very clear. It says, in other countries, political capital is not the driver for you to be an administrator in government. Perhaps it's first world countries, whereas in third world countries, it's a key driver. Therefore, having a political lineage or political environment exposure and being selected from structures of some kind is a very important factor for you to succeed. The other one was the understanding of the accountability at hand, which means, what is your mandate? who are the role players in your mandate? Who wants you to succeed? Who doesn't want you to succeed? How the board is constituted. If the board starts making decisions that are against you, you must already know that your career is already on the line. And you know that when that happens, the union is the first one to jump onto that, because most of the people that are found in some of the government departments, especially the middle layer, is always the one is on the survival game. So the more executives leave, the better it is for them to stay on their roles. And when they stay on their roles, the more they feel vindicated for another 5 years, another 5 years. And because every time you take somebody from the top, they have to build relationships when they come in. You can't really uproot the bad performance. So it was also when I realized that this whole thing we used to read about, where a decision is made in the board, everybody back in the office knows before you even get there. And I think those are some of the things that says actually then you should know. So from my side, that political support from accountability point of view in terms of decisions becomes very critical. If I had known better, I could have read those decisions that did not go according to me as a sign to go much earlier from the role. I could have said, okay, these are the signs. This thing shouldn't happen. I will never be successful here. I need to withdraw. That's if I knew better. But I did not at the time, because the drive to make free education happen was very important. The other thing that I then started to learn, just to bring you about the leader as a communicator, which is a very important one, was there's benefit to status quo remaining the way it is for other people. So for an example, as an NSFAS that pumps in billions of rands that go to first world institutions, your VETs, your UCTs, and pumps almost nothing to your University of Zululand and your Mangosuthu Technikon. Structurally, that is not supposed to happen. We are supposed to transform those institutions. We're supposed to make lives of the Black academics that are coming up better by making sure that they get enough money to can be able to build the institutions. But even with the existence of the NSFASs of this world and any other thing, we haven't made previously Black institutions any better. And I remember when I went and argued things in the university association, I started knowing that I'm making more enemies than I'm making friends, because I was advocating for the outside institutions that we always looked at them and say they are failing because of bad leadership. We forget that they are pricing the product for the market, and the price does not allow them to build the infrastructure required for them to compete. And therefore, we are always doomed for opportunities. And most of the people that are supposed to get the opportunities, employment opportunities, are coming from these Black institutions. And that is why we've got such a high unemployment rate of graduates that are coming from Black institutions, because we've tainted them ourselves as professionals. We wouldn't go and hire from University of Zululand, even if you are from there, because you are now told there's a new elite, there's a new product. So I got a sense there that even the structures themselves were not prepared for transformation. So Nolwazi, I think for me, once I was able to hit all these bumps and sought for empirical evidence, I then wanted to research this as part of my doctoral thesis, to be able to go and look for all these Black executives that tried to transition and failed, be it what we tried to do in SAA. Somebody asked if I told the reverse was true. And I think that's why I spoke about Daniel at ABSA and his experience in terms of that particular environment. Structurally, Daniel was set up for success. However, the system wasn't ready for that form of transformation that was being advocated for. So the 6 months waiting period to say, Daniel, you go into ABSA, allowed those who wanted this not to happen to maneuver, build their relationships, make the leadership changes that were required, consolidate their power, So when he came in and said, I'm going to drive an entrepreneurial culture, they said, this is not who we are. This strategy is not what we're going to go for. I suppose there aren't many that are coming from the public sector into the private sector that fail. I thought that one was more prevalent because it was playing itself out in the market. So the last point I just wanted to say is that the followers are always ready to get rid of you. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter how successful you are, but the voice is much more louder. I'm saying this to the BMF community. The voice is much more louder if you're a Black executive. I would want to just to make an example, you check the ESCOMs of this world, all these institutions that are now run by your white executives, there isn't as much noise. We are tolerating a lot more. We are shouting a little bit less. We are going into the street a little less. But if it was a Black executive, we'll be happy to see their demise. So I think for me, that is where I was coming from. It was when I wrote the article, to create awareness and maybe to bring in consciousness to the role that institutions like BMF needs to be playing, that we shouldn't celebrate structural systems that are there to destroy excellence and leadership, because at the end of the day, we see that as failure as opposed to an opportunity to learn and grow. And that's really how I ended up in academia with GIBS, because I wanted to bring my knowledge, my experience into the classroom to be able to say to you guys, to the guys in the classrooms, actually the world is much more different out there. We are turning on ourselves as Black executives, and we're not taking each other along, and we are allowing that we can chow each other as much as we want and leave everybody to succeed. In fact, one of the biggest things that this now is turning out to be a political conversation, Nolwazi, please pardon me. One of the assessment I did on my own was to check who are the finance directors in key sectors of government, in key municipalities. I found that a number of them are either white or Indian, and not so much Black executives. And these institutions were not transforming at pace, which was a demonstration of lack of trust on ourselves as executives and the likes. So I speak to those things. I'm happy to summarize some of the key lessons, but I wanted to come back to you, Nolwazi, and say, that's really what I wanted to kick off with, and maybe plug in some nuggets around the political suicide, some nuggets around turning on each other, the role of BMF not coming out quite clearly, always willing to support those that are politically affiliated. If those are not politically affiliated, they don't get support. And also just saying, take a look at what's happening in spheres of government, how much we show less tolerance on Black executives than we do on white executives. I'm going to pause there for a second and allow you and Nolwazi to engage.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Zwane. I found it very ironic that you mentioned ESCOM, because I'm currently a victim where they've load shed us without warning. So I'm sitting around a couple of candles at this point in time. And I see Ngelani has been touched by what you have said, because there's a comment there that says, oh dear, this is real talk. Thank you. And we also have a question from Tabang Malo. And his question is, that must have been quite harsh from a career perspective, as you mentioned. How did you navigate through that and build yourself again up and your reputation again? So I think that's quite an important question, because the career suicide that you mentioned happens even in the private sector. You know, if you upset the wrong person, that could mean you stagnate for a while, or that's the end of your current career. So how did you manage to build yourself up from that?
Firstly, I'll acknowledge the compliments being shared. I think when I come to a platform like this, I think I owe it to be frank about the views I've got, and hopefully we can do something about it as a collective. I call it maybe career suicide, because the public sector one plays itself out. The higher the role, it plays itself out in the public. So everybody sees that, and therefore you're being dented by whether the media or any form of toy stays there in the public domain for a while. And as you know, that when it comes to decision making, private sector does not want to touch you when you come from that sort of environment, particularly for the financial services sector where I spend most of my life. So maybe I did go into a mild depression during that particular period. I pondered whether there was going to be any way I could recover, and what else I needed to do to be able to recover and come back into the system, and whether I was ever going to be able to get opportunities to lead again. And I think it was all evident in the way that I wasn't being invited for interviews. And after going one interviews, you don't get another opportunity to come back. So there were a couple of things I did. One of them was, fortunately, I went and spent time with the head of the time head of faculty at GIBS, Dr. Morrison Ntombeni, who's now the acting dean of the school. And I think what he said to me was, I understand what you've gone through. I've seen people go through that. I know friends have gone through that. I know you. I know that this is all smoke and mirrors. Hang in there. And I applied for a teaching gig. He said, if you want to take out what's in your heart, and this is a platform you can give it to, I'm more than happy for you to trial and come and share your experience. And I was interviewed, I was successful. And that was maybe the first official gig I got after the NSFAS opportunity to be a lecturer at GIBS. I think it was quite a huge achievement for me, because as you've read out my life mission. The second one was to go back to my network in the private sector and banking, and start knocking on doors and maybe dispelling a lot of the noise that was there. Write a cover letter that states my side of the story, because I never wanted to play a shouting match with the institution, and I never wanted to respond. And that thing is a zero-sum game. You win nothing out of it if you don't have aspiration to be in a political office. So I then use my one-on-ones, go back to build relationships and networks. And I was fortunate that my good name at Absa at the time that I'd left, there were some people who still believed in it and gave me an opportunity to be back. But I think for me, one of the most important things was there were many decisions I chose that I want to be ethical in the way I deal with things, and that I want to make my children very proud, and therefore I wouldn't make decisions that will compromise that. And so there was a many tough calls that I made. But at the end of the day, when you are faced up with this, no income, you are by yourself and no one wants to take your CV, it's pretty tough. And you need people that are bold to make decisions that will actually bring you back into the playing field. So I think an executive at Absa made a bold decision by bringing me on board. Morrison Ntombeni made a bold decision for bringing me on board. And I think it was all because of what my prayer work was about, because of what they knew what I stood for. But I think it was much more tougher when some of the people that you had worked with that used to believe in you stop believing in you because of what's happening in the media. So I think for me, I recovered from that. And that is why when you learn something, I believe you must teach. So I take all my lessons from that, and I'm hoping to teach, share my experiences so that we can grow better and be better humans. And I think that's where really how I really survived that. And I think for me, the only thing I can do is try and make sure that a platform like this, we don't use it and take it for granted. I do think, Nolwazi, I had all the political exposure in my university years. I pride myself as having been a part of SASCO, having been the General Secretary of the ANC, of the SASCO-led SRC at the University of Zululand. But that was never the path I wanted my life to be about. I wanted to be about making a difference on the ground as an administrator. And I think that stood me in good stead when I was trying to come back. And I must say that it took me 5 years back from where my career would have been. And I'm still trying to recover from that and back into the mainstream. I'm relentless, I'm resilient, I remain driven, I remain ambitious. I blame no one for my cause. I made those choices, and I'm going to fight forward, and I'm going to bring in insights like this into conversations like this, and hopefully it makes a difference.
Wow, Thank you. Very inspirational indeed. We have a few comments on the chat that I'd just like to read out. So the first comment is from Jeremiah Muhapi. I hope I pronounced that correctly. And the comment says, very painful experience indeed. It's very funny because before you started speaking, I associated you with the failures of NSFAS. But hearing you speak, I now get where you are coming from. And the question is, so I just need to go. And the question is, what do you think needs to be done to overhaul and change the public sector?
This is a very political question, Olua. So I'll acknowledge the comments read and the positive sentiments. I don't think I'm in a position to answer the what can we do to overhaul the private sector, because as a country, we are a very unique society in that we are still led by the state. We rely on the state for employment, we rely on the state for a number of resources, and therefore the state still makes a number of calls and shots. And also we still have the view that says there's a huge career of windfalls if you're told you go into government. And a lot of young people believe that political direction is the way to go. And to a certain extent, the political play is always going to be a big one. And so the overhaul is about the commitment to want to bring about change. And to bring about change, there's a lot of skill set that sit in private sector. You must create an environment that is going to enable private sector people to transition and be successful in their roles. And until you create that, you have a challenge. So that is why I said the point you're mentioning is a political one, because I was one of those who were very excited when President Ramaphosa took office and came up with the slogan of Thuma Mina. And I was excited that there was a strategy behind it, and that Thuma Mina was a call to action to a number of Black executives who had the expertise and the know-how, who believe that they can come into the public sector and make a difference. It has fizzled out, and it hasn't given us the inspiration that we can go into the industry and play a role. And also it has still played out to the fact that until you're politically connected, you can never transition. So I would say anyone who wants to transition and really go and play a part, firstly, they must be really politically ready, must be ready to be stripped naked and be ready to play in that domain, be ready to carry people's bags, to ready to suck up, be ready to make a lot of, some of them ethical calls. And I think that's the readiness that I think we need to take up with ourselves. There isn't any particular system that gives me confidence as I sit here today that suggests there is room for an honest executive who wants to go into the public sector and make a difference. That is the heart speak. The action speak is completely different. It requires a different set of mind. Maybe I would also say that as members of institutions like BMF, I would love for us to be very much beyond the good news of who's been appointed, and look beyond the BE and start looking at an executive as a whole and protect the executive and enable the executive, and not just leave the executive to dry and forget that that executive was one of their own. Because at the end of the day, if institutions like BMF don't exist, if they don't try and position themselves differently about, actually we understand that the state needs our capabilities, however, it must reform. Even if it means we form a thought leadership group where we figure out how do we create a fertile ground for the skills to be exchanged. I think for me, that will be quite a big one to play. But I think for me, my role right now is the one that says, let's have a conversation. These things are real. People's careers have been destroyed, and there are people like me and you whose careers have been destroyed. It's been amazing that I've been in interviews for opportunities, and when I tell my story, somebody says, actually, I've experienced the same. And actually that my career had taken a step back because all of these things happened in public. We're leaving a lot of people injured and we're not even lifting them up. So I think for me, broadly, it's get ready to be politically aware, politically astute, to play the political game in more than the executive responsibility game, because that's what it turns out to be. And be prepared to say, if you call for tighter performance numbers, the people that you are holding accountable will remember that they've got a union, and then they will try and figure out how they get rid of you. And also remember that you're working in a society that celebrates failure or perceived failure of any sort. We are always quick to say somebody must be substituted, somebody must be removed, and we forget the opportunity that says no one turns out to be bad in 11 months. No one destroys an institution that has been dead for 25 years in 11 months, unless there's really somebody trying to apportion the blame. We are so quick to put people under the bus and carry on and move on and forget that at some point this was an executive that we supported. So Nolwazi, the point I'm just simply making is that a different think tank and dialogue, and then using the power of BMF, we can be able to have the conversations that favors management excellence and move beyond just the excitement of good news.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zwane. I think you've answered another question that was posed. You've just answered it by Nhlakanipho, because a question was around what would be the advice for someone that's going through or aspiring to go through a transition. So Nhlakanipho, I hope you have been answered. If you still have further questions, you can put it on the chat box or on the comments, and we'll read it out. And you've touched slightly on what the BMF could have done better. And I think these are very important conversations, considering that all 34 of the attendees that we have here are BMF members. So we all need to take it upon ourselves to do better after the session. So in that light, there's a question from Malcolm Mahlati, and the question is, what would you have expected from BMF during this difficult time? You rightfully state that we as BMF are quick to congratulate, but slow to show support when you're being dealt with politically or otherwise as Black professionals.
Yeah, maybe I'll go back to Nhlakanipho's point, Nolwazi, and maybe if you don't mind, I'll spend 2 minutes on it. Just read out what I said is a summary of my article, which I believe is something that is quite important. I say, without key stakeholder buy-in and support, making a meaningful impact becomes a challenge. And on its own, commitment, skill, experience, and passion can only move the needle up to so far. So perhaps this one applies in any particular environment of leadership, but I think I found this to be very critical. If you report to your board, if it's not fully supportive of your strategic intent, you'll always never be able to move the needle despite your passion. Number two is, no matter how much you believe in yourself and in the difference you can make, you need a clear mandate along with the board and leadership support, competent and committed resources, and the wisdom to know when the tide is turned against you. What I mean by that is, when decisions are no longer going your way at the board level, the tide has shifted, it's time to make the call. And I think for me, that was my biggest lesson. I should have read the signs up front and walked away with my credibility intact. But it's a lesson, and I take that away. The other point is, transition from corporate to public sector needs political readiness. Spend more time, like an actor will spend more time with the subject that they want to play in a movie. I suppose you need to spend more time with your political connects, administrators that are doing this job, that are doing well, and see if it's good for you before you even jump and transition. Perhaps if you go into junior and middle management, it's okay, you can get away with it. But if you go to the top of the platform, there are many people who believe they could have gotten the job and you did it, and they will make your life hell, and then they do a good job in that. And then the other one is leadership transitions. Researchers recommend that the transitioning leader be eased into the complexity of the public sector. So the eased into the complexity of public sector means have a mentor who's led in the public sector for a while, who has been through the trenches, who will then serve, guide you, and ease you into the role. In that way, it communicates two things. Those who are hiring you believe in you and want you to succeed. And secondly, it simply says that you're being cushioned from the early losses that you may get upfront. And then also be mentored and coached for a soft landing. I think this applies to any form of transition, Nolwazi, because we all want to be eased. Have you ever moved from one transitioning specialist to a generalist and then people expect you to perform? And at the end of that financial year, you get a bad rating because you are new in the role. You're not cushioned, you're not coached, you're not looked after during that particular transition, yet you're called to be talent. So we need to create environments like those for ourselves. Now, what would I have expected from a BMF? I think for me, I think my perspective is not that I would have expected BMF to do anything. I think in retrospect, I think BMF research should have found out that this is a trend. Something needs to be done about it. And therefore say, what can be our role to be able to deal with this trend? So I don't want this to be about Stephen wanted BMF to do something. No, I think for me, it was more about now that you've seen a trend like this, your own people are transitioning, wanting to lend a hand, yet they seem to be failing to do so. What is happening? What can be done? Because this is the asset that we believe in. This is the asset that keeps us going. So I just think that the question of what did I want BMF to do is not really the question I want to answer. The one is knowing better, you expect to do better. I think being afforded the opportunity to come and speak to BMF in this particular context, I'm hoping that we are making the ground fertile about realities like this, that you'll go back and start looking at what other examples of similar nature have happened. What do we learn from it? Is there an opportunity for a think tank on this? And because we want the skill sets to transition, because we want to see a better South Africa, we want organs of state to work, to function, to be successful, but there must be a long-term plan. And maybe this is the new BMF BE transitioning, because we've canvassed for people to be given opportunities. But beyond being given opportunities, there must be opportunity to say, how do we make sure that these opportunities are sustainable? And I think we've seen a lot of recycling that's taking place of leadership that tells us that there's some gaps in this process that needs to be closed. So I think that will be my response to that, Nolwazi.
Thank you, Mr. Zwane. I really appreciate how you end up answering the other comments through your comment, just so I know we are all aligned here, because there was a question from Tavang again around what can be done by the BMF from a strategic perspective. And I think you've just now answered that. We do have a thought leadership and research capability. So the suggestion is use that better to benefit the Black people. Guys, if there's any other comments or questions that you have, please do share that with us. Mr. Zwane, the question that I personally have is around board leadership and board composition, because I know you touched on that a lot. One of the things that we strive for as young people in the BMF and outside of the BMF is really having those board appointments at some point in time. Yeah. So I'd like to find out from you, what advice could you give to the people on the call today on what can you do better? I mean, you mentioned getting a sponsor, getting a mentor, but what else can you do to ready yourself for that position as well? Because as a young person, when you come into these positions, you know, you're still too young, you don't have enough experience, but how can we ready ourselves so that in 5 or 10 years time, we are sitting in a position where we can also say, I am head of, or, you know, I sit on these boards.
Yeah. So Nolwazi, I think for me, one of the things you spoke about is that I run a non-profit organization that teaches grade 11s about leadership and entrepreneurship skills. And we've been doing that for the last 17 years. And we've learned a lot about that. One of them is everything that you are embarking on is a journey and it needs you to invest in it. And if the journey is to be a board member, there are many enough non-profit organizations willing to have you on board. Volunteering your time in there to understand the statutes that govern that particular nonprofit, gives you an opportunity to engage and understand what it takes to succeed in those particular areas. And I think for me, that's one of the biggest lessons just in life, that if I did not have Wired, I think I would have struggled to succeed after the NSFAS World, because I remember that I'm here to make an impact, and I've got enough of many years of having made an impact. And then I've got young people that have gone on to achieve great things, and therefore I can get back at it. And if I get back at it, I'll be an inspiration to them. They'll remember that when they come up a setback, they will be able to recover. So for me, I'd say, let's start slow, volunteer, be part of the small formations. Being part of this formation is also one of those things. The second thing that I've got in my mind is, to a certain extent, be willing to be overlooked because you stand for particular things. And you know, one of the things that I've learned and observed about board roles is that people who get into those roles never want to leave, and therefore they end up compromising what they stand for because they want to retain the seat. So go for the places where your skill sets and your diversity of thought can be accepted and you're willing to pursue those. And of course, pursue it with somebody who's done it before. Pursue it with somebody who has made a career out of it. But I think the last one for me is, be successful in what you're great at. If you become successful in what you're great at, these opportunities start opening themselves up to you. And most of the time, we want to learn from experience, but we didn't put it in our vision board, because what you put in your vision board is what you invest in, and what you invest in is what you get the outcome from. And I think for me, you play the long game in that. And I don't think right now the issue of board roles is anything that has to do with age. I think it's about intent. The people in leadership must have intent. It's exactly like appointment of executives. The organization's HR and leadership must have the intent to transform, the intent to change. And most of the time, there's that political will that is missing for these things to be transformed. So what I'm saying is, go for institutions that are open for your ideas. Get yourself mentored and coached. Volunteer for those services. Earn your way into those particular roles. And I think there's nothing as a good word like a good, successful person who's got credentials to back them up. So continue to make sure you've got enough to back you up.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Mr. Zwane. I am definitely going to update my vision board. I don't know about the rest of the people online. There is a request here from Malcolm just after you answered what can the BMF do differently? And he's asking, would you be willing to engage and to assist the BMF with research on trends and to guide the advocacy and lobbying that the BMF does? Can we get you in contact with him?
No, absolutely. I think that's how I ended up in this platform. I was invited by a friend who used to run the BMF Eastern Cape, because one of my competencies is to drive strategy sessions for advocacy groups. I prefer to run strategy sessions for advocacy groups because I get an opportunity to learn and I get an opportunity to make an impact. So we built a relationship from there on. And then after that, when I wrote the article and then we engaged, I said to him, this is what the BMF must be having a conversation about. I think for me, and Nolwazi, as opposed to research, I would say, let's have the dialogue. Okay. Sometimes the dialogue is really about bring people that you believe may have been scarred by similar acts, put them around the table, understand what it means for them, understand what they are willing to give. There's no one as powerful as somebody who's been injured, but yet they are willing to say, learn from my wound. And I think for me, we can do a lot better to learn from each other's wounds. For me, I'm willing to get into a dialogue and for us to come up with strategies that says, actually, how do we start spotting these? So not only just landing softly a new executive on the other side, but supporting them throughout that journey. And supporting them throughout that journey is that, you know, a number of executives that have retired, that have done this transition very well. appoint them, get them into the and say, this is the person we want to succeed. We see them going far, but they are going into a role that has political turmoil, that anything that goes wrong, they may be just tainted. Just support them, give them the guidance, give them the support. And therefore we then do the data set that says, what does it mean? What can the state do to cushion and ease? But also call out the hypocrisy that comes in on the racial lines when it comes to these transitions. Call it out when you see it and act on it. And I think for me, yes, the answer, sorry I went too long, the answer is I will be willing to get into dialogues like that. Because I believe in this, I'm very passionate about it.
Yes, thank you so much, Mr. Zwane. I'm just trying to go through all the comments here. You know, they're coming in very fast. So I just want to see if it's any questions for you or, you know, general people that are sharing and, you know, saying thank you for this session. And, you know, as you said, Mr. Zwane, I think this is a discussion that needed to be had. I think a lot of people are touched and inspired to just have these conversations and really engage in a safe space is what I believe BMF really should be for Black executives. And I'd really like to thank you for sharing your time and your wisdom with us. And I'd just like to find out if you have any closing remarks that you'd just like to close with before we hand back to our chair.
So I think first and foremost, I think it was bold of you to bring up a topic like this. And to invite somebody that not many people in this call know about and maybe have experienced and understood the story. But I also say I appreciate the opportunity to come and engage about things I'm interested in. I believe in this country and I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. And I believe that I have a duty to make a change, whether it's sharing my intellectual capital with the organization or whether it's any other way of doing very well in my job so that other people can look up to me and be successful and aspire to be like me, whether it's my youth programs involvement. All I try to do is to be the best I can be. I believe in this tool called BMF. I just think that there are many opportunities to pivot and pivot towards embedding the skill set of leadership differently in all spheres. And I think for me, I'm quite excited and I appreciate the opportunity. All the comments being made. Thank you very much for taking the time, for sharing, for wanting to be engaged. The questions that have been asked, I don't take any of those for granted. I'm just honored to have been invited and truly appreciate it. Nolwazi, you've been such a great host. Thank you for allowing, with your candles on. Thank you for keeping on. I really enjoyed my time. I'm more than happy to have further conversations if invited, but otherwise, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Zwane. Before I hand over to our chair to close off the session or to open up to the members, I'd just like to read a few of the comments that I can see. If I don't read your question, please, I am not skipping you. I'm just not seeing everything. So I'm just going to read that which I can see right now. I see that there is a comment from Ayanda Masina. And her comment is, this is so spot on about directorships with the youth. Too many young people don't understand that you must actually be a specialist or an expert in a particular field that you can offer to the board that you will be serving on. Trifina has responded and she says, thank you. I'm going to update my vision board. That's what we like. We like a clear call to action. I'm passionate about increasing women active participation in property as well as coaching and mentorship. And she has put her website. So please, guys, do go onto the website and see a little bit more about what Trifina has said. Monday has also put in a comment to say this should be a further online engagement on the matter, and Joburg branch can lead on this engagement. And he's very happy to tag along and create a space for the dialogue that Mr. Zwane is talking about. Thank you very much. You see, clear call to actions. Sakumzi says, thank you to Stephen and the BMF branch. There's a lot of thank yous on the group. So thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mr. Zwane. It's been such a pleasure engaging with you, and I'm looking forward to everything else that we're still going to do outside of the session. And Chair, I'd like to hand back to you then.
Thank you, Nolwazi, for doing such a stirring work of being our host and facilitating the session. And we are indebted as the Management Committee of Johannesburg Branch. To Mr. Zwane, thanks again to you. I know one of the things which maybe I should also easily brag to the audience is that you are quite accessible, regardless of the many roles and the responsibilities you have. You are one of the few people who I could pin and say you are easily accessible. And it's also not easy actually to find people who have went at that higher level of roles or responsibilities in both private and public sector, who would actually revert to you after you made an attempt to you. So that was a key take home for me. But over and above that, we agree in principle that this conversation should only not end here, mainly because over and above the life experiences of Mr. Zwane, the next person will be Mr. Newman, and the next person will be Simthi Nolwazi. And it will be a chain which will continue in that sequence if we do not take an effort in life or even with the social capital that we have as professionals to try and actually find strategies, like you put it, to say we need to find strategies to overcome and to navigate all of them through this. I'm very much thankful to you to have made time this evening. And it was actually an easy one. When I was in conversation with Umfundo Jekeje to say, reach out to the gentleman. Actually, I even reverted to him to say, no, it's just a flowing conversation, same as the conversation tonight. It was a quick and an easy flowing one. But importantly is that the conversation will go on, Mr. Zwane. We'll appreciate to have you more. I'm sure with the way I've been easily accessing you, it will also be easier when we come with a future engagement. This is not the last, and even the following one will not be the last. And that said, thank you, and thank you very much, and good evening.
Thank you very much. Cheers, guys.